Good day, and welcome to the last and perhaps most important video in our training series of cases. Before we begin, I would like to discuss some background information as context for why this case in particular holds so much importance in our minds as we continuously work to improve MCG not only for physicians but also for their patients. A 10-year, $100 million ischemia study was conducted, sponsored by a grant from the U.S. National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute of the National Institutes of Health, which we will be summarizing in the interest of time as such. First, there appears to be no difference in outcomes between interventional treatments versus conservative medical management as it stands now with currently used diagnostic modalities and treatment methods. Secondly, 13 to 15% of major adverse cardiac events occurred in both of the two arms of this costly, multi-center study from locations equipped with the most advanced cardiac imaging tests in the world. Despite that, the patients that suffered MACE, including sudden cardiac death, were missed entirely by these conventional tests, and establishments on the level of teaching research hospitals, places that are meant to be known for their capabilities in patient care and diagnosis. If MCG were used, we can confidently state that those patients would have at least been given a better fighting chance at knowing their issues beforehand, rather than being missed and left in the dark until it was too late to help them. But why is that important to bring up now for this case in particular? What about this is relevant to this patient? Today, we follow the tragic story of a 55-year-old man who, like those 15% missed in both arms of the trial, suffered a major adverse cardiac event after years of being told that his tests were all normal. What makes his case so unique, however, is that 3 years prior, he had an MCG test performed on him which, for reasons we will detail later, he chose not to act upon. It gives us a perfectly clear, mathematically analyzed example of what happens when a patient continues to live with no changes to their lifestyle while their cardiovascular system is in a critical, dangerous, yet still recoverable state. Our patient first presented himself for testing on MCG due to extreme frustration with his prior cardiologist, who he had lost confidence in. At the age of 55, he complained of constant stress, overwork, and exhaustion, along with other symptoms that led to him obtaining 2 stents in his RCA and LAD before he turned 50. This unfortunately did not help what he felt were clear problems with his heart, despite the follow-up stress testing reporting his condition as normal. His first and only MCG session reported on the 8-category scale created by Dr. Shen, rating from A to H being the worst, placed him in the alarming category of G based on his scores and prognosis. Normally, this would be the cause for immediate action, with alternating global and local ischemia and secondary and tertiary findings showing multiple active pathologies that favored his left coronary circulation tree territories. Of course, an overwhelming majority of patients, if properly treated and carefully monitored, do recover with their conditions reversed, even under circumstances like these. Sadly, however, after this test, the physician that administered it lost contact with him. He never submitted for follow-up testing or other treatments and never gave another call. It was 3 years until we obtained any updates on his condition. His son was kind enough after that to share his story, out of a desire for people to understand the kind of man his father was. The man was working 13 to 15-hour days on a regular basis at 2 jobs to keep his family afloat due to medical expenses from his wife's lymphoma treatment, costs that were, in his son's words, bankrupting the family. He chose to forego his own treatment, risking his own heart for his wife, and completely disregarded his own health. In the end, his wife thankfully went into remission, but he perished of a massive heart attack 3 years later after his initial session. The ultimate sacrifice that he made for his family simply cannot be overstated. We wish them the best and are eternally grateful for the chance to review his case, to better understand what led to the loss of a life of a dedicated father, husband, and man. His initial MCG session scores on a severity scale rating from 0 to 22 were recorded as 10, 11, and 9.5, with the presence of alternating local, focal, and global ischemia favoring a more functional, high-level myocardial ischemia and a rather dangerous late stage of coronary artery disease. The numbers alone were cause for alarm at the time, but as we press onwards, The secondary markers were positive for ventricular and incipient ventricular fibrillation, cardiomyopathy, myocardial damage, and structural abnormalities such as rheumatic heart disease-like anomalies, probably caused by his severe ischemia and congenital anomalies, both of which required further exploration and monitoring. His MCG pathophysiological findings reported the presence of myocardial remodeling, both decreased and increased myocardial compliances, decreased ejection fractions below 50%, and global asynchrony indicating a delay of the V5 territory of the heart, a significant factor in reporting poor prognosis when it is combined with ischemia and high MCG severity scores. Simply put, the combination of these findings along with his high severity score was incredibly alarming at the time. Again, the normal diagnostic methods and testing methods he underwent kept reporting his condition even there as entirely normal, which was unfortunately a major source of his frustration and distrust for his cardiologists. These are graphical representations of the auto-power spectra measurements of this patient's test sessions. The decreased power peak counts of his V5 lead signal output when contrasted with a normal control patient is, at the very least, startling. This expression of measurable signs of illness were quickly and immediately detected by our system where other modalities utterly failed him in years past. When comparing his cross-power spectrum graphs to a normal control patient, and when reviewing his transfer function graph, the differences are startlingly profound. It cannot be overstated how badly he was failed by the conventional methods when these issues were allowed to develop and persist for what could have been multiple decades before they reached this point. For now, however, we must move on. The function impulse response is useful for looking at the response of the system to an internal or external stimulus. It can be used to measure the myocardial compliance. When it's increased, this may mean that there is acute myocardial damage or myocarditis to ischemia. When it's reported as decreased, it may indicate myocardial hypertrophy or decreased stiffness of the myocardium due to inflammatory changes, just as a few examples. Here, MCG detects an acute increased and a chronic decreased myocardial compliance in a very complex combination, indicating increased and decreased stiffness of his heart in multiple places throughout the session, leading to various expressions of different kinds of arrhythmia. These expressions are exclusively observed during chronic/acute expressions of a chronic coronary artery disease. It's not often that we are confronted by such dire conditions, but as we observe these graphs, we observe a mathematical systems snapshot of a heart that is struggling to hold out before complete collapse and sudden cardiac death. On the other hand, this function is also perfect for measuring the effectiveness of treatment methods by analyzing and understanding the functional recovery from positive stimuli. Cross-correlation allows us to better understand the supply and demand imbalance patterns that the patient was suffering as a result of acute ischemia and metabolic heart disease, even without anatomic coronary artery obstruction being involved in this patient's case. For phase angle shift visualization, the expressions shown indicated a shift towards the left side of the system, most likely due to the functional metabolic ischemia affecting his left coronary arterial tree. There was mainly functional ischemia that presented itself in his system at the time, caused by a number of factors, but most especially by the acute stress put upon his system by metabolic disease, and of course, considering his life conditions at the time, extremely high levels of stress hormones. Information at this degree of sensitivity and specificity, able to pick down the root causes of a patient's cardiac disease, was simply not available to the patient in any environment until he encountered MCG. The amplitude histograms and coherence function can serve as the bridge to move from one better functional environment to a worse one, or vice versa. We believe the differences between the normal control graph and his measurements at this point can speak for themselves. These colored heat maps of the multiple functions are useful not only for visualization of the mathematical output, but also act as gateways to better machine learning color matrices for pattern recognition and disease severity calculations, allowing for early warning of progressive heart failure and sudden cardiac death. When considering the patient's case here, it's possible that his heightened heart failure acceleration could be due to a combination of acute or chronic diseases, along with metabolically induced myocardial diseases and what must have undoubtedly been severe amounts of stress hormones. These mathematical structural element matrices collect the results of the functions described previously in one place. These patterns are those of a patient facing sudden cardiac death and can be highly predictable and reproducible thanks to the methods used by our diagnosis engine. These enable physicians to identify patients at high risk of mostly reversible MACE and sudden cardiac death, even those 15% that would normally be missed in the prior trials that we mentioned earlier in the presentation. The engine, upon discovery of these patterns combined with MCG severity scores, generates a report that the physicians administering the test can then use to decide on a course of action for their patient to reverse the threat of death and save a life. However, in the case of this patient, these parameters demonstrated to the engine that permanent, functional alterations were taking place in his cardiovascular system at the time of testing. If acted upon, this information could have been vital in saving his life. However, after MCG detected the gravely alarming level of ischemia in his left coronary territory, along with the acute myocardial infarction, it was demonstrated definitively that all prior treatments and stress tests were simply not enough to save him. If this information that he failed to obtain from any cardiologist he'd gone to before had been available multiple years sooner, earlier into his condition before it reached the point it did on time of testing, he might have stood a much better chance, but as it stands, due to the failure of the current industry to fulfill the needs of patients like him, and the financial woes it laid upon his family, the world lost a truly dedicated father and husband. Once again, we offer the deceased's next of kin our sincerest sympathies and thanks for allowing us to speak on the man's story, and of his condition as analyzed by our system, and must bring attention again to the previously mentioned 10-year ischemia study. He, for years, had been one of the 15% who were utterly missed by other current diagnostic tests, one of 17 million who die each year around the world as a result of sudden cardiac death. This man's case was an absolute tragedy. But one cannot ignore the fact that there are countless others like him that suffer from inaccessibility to tests like MCG that can give them the information they need to at least be able to make a conscious, informed, and potentially life-saving decision. The vital predictive information MCG provides is not only beyond what current techniques offer for imaging solutions at the microscopic levels, but also steps far beyond what all current technologies provide at the gross anatomic scale of an organ. Critically important physiological information is made available by our diagnostic engine, bringing up the knowledge gap between the two methods by providing functional, mathematically calculated expressions of the vital, dynamic, and complex intricacies of the heart. The 13 to 15% MACE rate, due to critical lack of better tools, could be eliminated outright if MCG is widely adopted, thanks to the new discipline we are proud to call computational electrophysiology. It's a term we use to describe the method by which we created MCG as a diagnostic modality, a foundation upon which more technologies like it for other parts of the human body can be created, allowing us to accurately detect and monitor patients suffering high risk of sudden cardiac death. With this, personal monitoring can be combined with ongoing primary lifestyle and secondary prevention measures to prevent and reverse the risks of sudden cardiac death, and allow people to hopefully live out longer, happier lives. The time for a new standard of care to step in is now. The handiwork of 2 generations of mathematicians, engineers, physicians, and more have cultivated an opportunity to finally take a stand at the routinely accepted yearly death rate of 17 million people from cardiovascular disease, starting with wider adoption of our technology. With this video being the final entry of our first presentation series, we would like to take this time to look back and remember some of the important points to take away from the experiences we've gained going over the patients we have discussed thus far. First, MCG technology detects cardiac functions where other currently applied tools fail, capable of finding life-threatening issues earlier than any modality on the market, enabling physicians to apply effective preventative measures in a timely manner when possible. Second, the technology can be effective in quantitative monitoring of a patient's heart dysfunctions easily in a timely manner that detects potentially deadly signs of sudden cardiac death to save lives by filling the critical information and knowledge gap that plagues the world of cardiology. Third, Our diagnosis engine can assist the physician to measure sudden surges in cardiac dysfunction as a result of acute illnesses, such as severe myocarditis, pulmonary embolisms, hypertensive crises, major hemorrhages, severe dehydration, heat stroke, acute high-altitude sickness, general anesthesia or chemotherapy-induced cardiac dysfunction, acute metabolic syndrome-induced heart failure, and ultimately preventing sudden cardiac death. With our system, physicians can provide timely preventative measures at the patient's bedside to reverse these deadly major adverse cardiac events before they can threaten a life. Based on our experience over the years, the overwhelming majority of these incidences are completely reversible, and each time when action was taken, lives were saved. Fourth, the MCG can be used to objectively measure the immediate, intermediate, and long-term effectiveness and outcomes of treatments, ranging from primary preventive lifestyle methods, drugs, and interventional procedures, without human bias and conflicts of interests. Due to MCG measurements being performed by an objective computer system, all reports are 100% evidence-based. Fifth, finally, MCG technology can assist clinical researchers to further their research on numerous known or newly discovered clinical entities, to further the understanding of the cardiovascular physiology and improve treatment designs and discoveries in an objective, ethical, honest, and trustworthy manner. We hope this series has helped you better understand the variety of situations that MCG can be the most useful to both patients and doctors alike. Bear in mind, this device's accuracy and specificity are achieved with only a few minutes of bedside testing, with reporting and analysis available anywhere in the world with a stable internet connection, and a test simple enough to perform that anyone can be trained to perform good quality tests, making the device a scalable solution for physicians who wish to provide affordable, fast testing to a wider range of patients than could ever be possible with current, more expensive and expert-driven modalities. MCG is the future of cardiac diagnostic care. Thank you very much for your time and your continued support. Again, as always, if you have any additional questions and comments, please feel free to send an email to info@premierheart.com and visit our website. And have a wonderful rest of the day.